Hello and welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. I am your host, Max, and joining me, of course, as always, is my co-host, Troy, and making sure that all the levels are right and we don't say anything we're not supposed to is Jay, working behind the scenes. Today's episode is about a game that I don't know necessarily is underappreciated, but not remembered as much as I think it should be. And that is the Games Workshop cult classic, Dark Future. And it is a game of techno-dystopian road rage.
Yeah, you're going to have to get me up to speed on this one. This is kind of a blind spot I have in the whole GW verse. So I'm kind of interested to see where this one comes from. Is this like adjacent to Rogue Trooper? Is it from the 2000 AD verse, or is it like its own thing?
No, it's definitely its own thing, but it is pulling influence from popular culture for sure. So the game was published in 1988, Games Workshop, of course. It's created by Mark Gascon and Richard Halliwell, of course. Most people know that. And of course, the rest of the team at the studio. Now, it's funny because this game is a vehicular combat game, first and foremost. And I would say that its main influence is probably the movie Mad Max. And I mean that specifically. I know that there's definitely elements that are drawn from things like Road Warrior, the sequel to the movie, but that is set in a genuinely post-apocalyptic world with no government, at least so far as we understand. The movie Mad Max is set in a more like a dystopian setting where society is in the process of crumbling. And that is very much what Dark Future feels like, along with having a lot of other elements. As you mentioned, with the 2080 reference, I think you could draw a lot of parallels and influence from The Cursed Earth, that being the Judge Dredd setting.
Oh, very cool.
Right? So it has this idea that there are these vast areas of wasteland between this. I wouldn't go as far as to call them megacities because they don't really refer to them that much. Though there are dense urban centers. Yes. I don't know if they go as far as to call them like country occupying cityscapes, but they're definitely dense populated areas.
Right. So you might not have like a seaboard spanning sprawl, but you do have these like epicenters of people.
Yeah, and so that's why I don't think of it as much, like, it definitely takes a lot from Road Warrior.
Right.
And various other post-apocalyptic genre elements, but it's a setting with a society in it. It's just a very fractured and violent society. Now, this game is probably, from what I can tell, more famous for its Black Library novels than it is for the actual game, which, in all fairness, the game itself looks like they were, at least when they wrote it, were pretty committed to making it work. Like, not only does it have a full set of rules in a box set, materials that include things like modular highway tiles, plastic cars and bikes, a lot of counters and templates. It's also got an expansion to it called White Line Fever, which it works a little bit like errata to some degree, but actually expands a lot of the rules and includes a lot of stuff for campaign play. And then it has more scenarios than I was expecting in various White Dwarf magazines. And to be fair, the late 80s, early 90s was when White Dwarf was really cool. So I'm not too surprised that the magazine had that. It was just, oh, wow, they were actually pretty committed to making this game work. And it didn't work for a few reasons we'll get into later. Yeah, the book it's got all the old school diagrams you'd expect from a company like Games Workshop. The art is, I think it's great. I didn't find anything that jumped out at me as being weird looking. It's all black and white, but it definitely is leaning into this sort of Mad Max Road Warrior vibe. I will also add that it has a strong element of like Blade Runner, like cyberpunk future. It's weird because I don't know that you think of the movie Blade Runner as being cyberpunk in the way that, like, it's not cyberpunk in the Gibsonian way. Like, you don't really see people with like implants so much, but there is this idea that human beings are living alongside of machines. And this setting has that same feeling. And there are things like laser weapons and stuff like that. Like it gets kind of out there, but I think in a good way, in a way that I think if it were just a scrappy post-apocalyptic car war game. Oh, Car Wars being another thing that it's probably taking from the Steve Jackson game, which came out 81, 82.
Right, of course.
The two games are very different from each other in a number of ways. And I can get into that when we get into the systems. But they knew enough of the themes and the cultural references in this to create to give it some legs, right? So they could include a lot of wild sci-fi elements, and they could also include a lot of grounded sort of scavenging and surviving stuff and everything in between.
When you like got into Dark Future, I mean, how did you get into it? I guess is the better way to phrase that. Was this something that you bought your way into with a starter set, or was there like army lists or codexes, or like what's the way that you engage with this game? You said there's an expansion and a core game. Are there like different armies, or how does that function?
So the first time I personally encountered this game was in a rule bargain bin at my local game store or comic shop.
Oh, cool.
And I do not have that copy, and I never ended up playing it, but I was really into the sort of Mad Max post-apocalyptic road warrior thing, and I was looking for something like that, and it was cheap. I didn't have White Line Fever because that was a separate thing, and it was actually the rule book minus the box set, so I didn't have any of the minis either. In all fairness, it was the first Games Workshop product I ever engaged with. I was aware that it existed, but I didn't have any like knowledge of that thing outside of that. And this is like in high school. Yeah, so it was just something that I kind of like thought was cool. I was getting into role-playing games at the same time, so I wasn't sure how it factored into that, but obviously I knew what war games were, and I had an interest in that. So this is really much my introduction to something that is more tactical.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that's as much as I could say. I don't know that I focused on it a lot, but my aesthetic view, the cool factor that I find with Games Workshop as a company comes from this game.
Right.
Like my expectations for what their products should look and feel like is very much based on Dark Future for some reason. And I never read any of the novels. I've heard they're good, and they've got these fun characters in them.
Yeah, there's like there's a trilogy, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a trilogy of novels. There might be some other story. I remember reading some of the stories, or the excerpts that they write into the book, which are pretty fun. And it was fun going back and looking at them. But yeah, so it comes all packed together with everything you'd need. The rules are interesting. That was, I think, something that I didn't fully retain the first time from looking at it, but I can see how they have a certain kind of complexity about them that might not make them super accessible. There's some elements that I recognize from other games, particularly like Avalon Hill games and Steve Jackson games. So Car Wars is an interesting comparison because Car Wars isn't always played. Not that I've never seen it played on a road track, but it's usually played like a demolition derby in an arena. And it's much less serious and less cinematic. It's way more simulative. I mean, that's just a hallmark of Steve Jackson style games. GURPS is obviously the pinnacle of this.
Yeah, right.
It is like universally granular, and everything fits into everything else, and everything like counts down singularly. It has things that are similar to racing board games. I'm familiar with a few of them. I think there's a game called F1 that someone was telling me about, but the one that I immediately think of is Avalon Hill's Circus Maximus. It actually has some interesting similarities to that I've heard are common in other racing games. So these are things like speed is declared before initiative, and everyone declares their speed at the same time. And in fact, in this, you also have to sort of declare your maneuver as well. So it almost works like simultaneous turns, but it creates this cool thing where you're second guessing what your opponent's going to do, and it could result in cars like colliding into each other, which is makes it that cinematic experience.
Yeah.
You don't have as much control that you do in Car Wars. It is really trying to reach for that more cinematic tearing of metal, things flipping over, stuff exploding. Whereas like in Car Wars, the vehicles are a lot more durable. They've got layers of armor. You have a gear phase where you determine how fast you're going and you determine your movement. And then that can fold into or then followed by a combat phase where there's essentially 3 positions or 3 types of weapons. So there are like front-mounted weapons that basically fire in the line of the vehicle.
And this is first striking, like down the line forward.
Yes. And then there are reverse firing weapons, typically things like oil slicks and mines.
Oh, so they're not like a ballistic shooting a gun like you are forward. It's like when you fire behind you, it's like James Bond car almost.
It's more like a trap, that you lay out.
Yeah, okay.
I think I may have gone looking over White Line Fever that there are rules for putting guns that face backwards.
Oh, that's cool.
And I believe there's even a James Bond car that has that. Probably more than one, actually.
Probably.
Yeah, like probably a license plate that moves aside and then like a machine gun comes out. But yeah, most of the examples they give in the core rules are dropped bombs, mines, oil slicks, that kind of thing. Stuff that's meant to more affect things like tires. And they're referred to as passive weapons. And then the last type of weapon is, I guess, a pivoting weapon that is fired sometimes by a turret on top of the car. And this is interesting because it's often weaker and less reliable than the forward-facing guns, but it can shoot essentially in a straight line to another vehicle without having to reposition your vehicle. There's 3 chassis types in the original one, so there's obviously the cars and bikes. They also have stats for trucks. I'm trying to remember if that was in White Line only. No, I'm pretty sure it's in the core rules. And effectively, it's a similar, bigger thing. And I think there's I remember seeing scenarios in there that are based around convoy missions, which are built around a sort of, you can imagine the final chase sequence in Road Warrior.
Right.
That's one of those direct references where you're like, yeah, this is a scenario where you're supposed to protect a truck and the other guys are like coming up the back and trying to blow everybody apart. In some of these things, this is where I found some of the noodliness in the rules. So firing on things are basically pretty easily. They use like a handful of D6s, and then there's some combination of the driver's skill or the weapon's firing ability to either avoid damage or hit. And a lot of it has to do with lining your weapons up depending on what kind you're using. The tricky part in some senses is when you hit turns in the road and the line of sight of your forward guns is not based. So, sorry, I kind of got ahead of myself. I should describe how the track works.
Oh, okay. Good point.
Yeah. So the track, it's basically like road tiles that are divided into, it wouldn't be entirely accurate to say they're divided into 8 lanes, but they basically are. A car covers 2 of those lanes. You can almost think of it kind of like a rectangular grid because those lanes are then broken up into divisions that create a kind of oblong grid that goes along the length of the road. Those divisions are not necessarily always in an equal spacing. Like, for instance, in a corner, there are fewer divisions if you're going around, like if you're making a turn. And the idea is that obviously, if you're driving, when you go to the inside lane, there's a shorter distance to make the turn. But at the same time, you're turning a lot harder, so there's a disadvantage to that. So there's this nice mechanical balancing that happens where you take risk. And the same thing is in other games like Car Wars and Circus Maximus and other racing games that I've heard of, which is the basic balancing idea with the driving, never mind the fighting, is you either take longer to go around the outside, which is safer, or you try to hug the inside at the risk of spinning out.
Right, of course. Yeah, you play the inside line.
And it depends on how fast you're going, right? So there's all these factors. And this is sort of, again, is starting to allude to the idea of like all the things that you kind of have to juggle in your brain. And I think it's one of those games that once you start playing it a little bit at a time, you're going to get it. It doesn't seem impossible to understand. It seems eminently playable. But there are some daunting elements Also, like, like the in-universe time for anything happening are like seconds, whereas in like every other game, it's probably minutes.
Right.
Maybe some skirmish games operate in seconds. So the idea is that you can only do so many things, and it's dependent on what you did in your gear phase. So the faster you go, effectively, the more things you can do at higher risk because you're going faster. This doesn't include shooting things or attacking. You effectively can only do one of those things. But you can weave up and then like ram a guy in the back. The weaving is determined by how fast you go, and that determines how many spaces you can move. And then when you ram, that's when you have to determine what the driving skill is and how the rest of that folds out.
And is ramming like the melee equivalent?
Yeah, that's essentially ramming and hard braking in front of somebody.
Yeah, totally.
So that they smash into your rear bumper. Yeah, those are the... Oh, and you can sideline, like you can press into the side of a car and force it to move.
Oh, that's cool.
It's fairly dependent on the comparative driving skill of both vehicles, but you can try to run somebody off the side of the road. And there's interesting tables for like spin outs and things. The actions they kind of operate as a sort of, before moving, there's a declarative, like I'm going to do this, this, and this. The declaratives are maneuver, accelerate, brake, reverse. If you've been tipped, like if you've lost control, then regaining control is like sometimes the only action that you can take. And then you can ram and shoot. As I said, like there's a logic to this. And I don't think that it's not something you can understand. It's just a lot of things to think about. Like, for instance, if the track is turning, do my guns face the guy? And then like you can simply draw a straight line to them. But then there's factors based on how far away they are. And so now you're not using the grid, you're using the equivalent of the grid moving through space. You're basically using a ruler. It's not uncommon for GW games and war games in general of this era to do that, where it's like, oh, well, the grid is a convenience, but like effectively you're going to have to draw a straight line at some point and measure.
Yeah, exactly.
And modern board games at this time are almost a separate thing happening somewhere else, are not influencing this. Even though it's more cinematic, it's being thought of in that simulationist Car Wars, Steve Jackson kind of paradigm.
Right.
Even though it's not quite as hardcore and detailed as that.
And that's because it has its roots in wargaming more specifically than anything else, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There's also a fair bit of vehicle customization that was also kind of making me sweat while I was going through it. It's definitely not as crunchy as, say, like custom building your own mech in BattleTech.
That is intense. I get that.
It's not quite that much, but there are considerations of how vehicle weights and weapons are going to affect your driving ability and what will happen if you get hit. Things like bikes are interesting in the sense that they are fast, maneuverable. In some ways, they're more steady in their driving, but like one hit and they're gone. I think there might be rules for them to reset themselves and try to like come back on. So effectively getting back on the bike. But in most cases, it just sort of seems like they get wiped instantaneously. And if you think about the plot with the bikers in Mad Max, that kind of follows. Like when Max starts going after them, they're basically just getting like wiped out by the car.
Yeah, they're just chaff, man.
Yeah. Like when he decides to make a move, it really is to his advantage until he actually has to take on the boss, who's also in a car.
Right on.
The track generation is also a really interesting element that has some technical complications in it, at least that I can perceive. I didn't see any reference to this issue, but the track pieces are basically procedurally generated by dice rolls. So you roll a d6, it's 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4, and 5 and 6, and that's either straight, left, or right. And you put down those sequences ahead, and you're always so many head tiles ahead of what's happening. And then you remove those tiles from behind and then start building the track forward. Well, you can see how if you're on a table, that could get a little bit complicated, where you're either having to reposition the parts of the track. And to be fair, there's only so many tiles you have out at once that it's not hard. It wouldn't be too hard to like slide everything back to the center of the table, but the fact that you might feel like doing that. The other option is maybe you have a lot of space and you do it on the floor.
Okay. Yeah. You could totally use like a floor or even a pool table if you wanted and just go.
Yeah. But even on a pool table, because we were talking about our table sizes before, and it's like, well, you want something that you can reach.
Yeah.
But like if the battle terrain is constantly generating itself around the table, then you're going to have to move it so that it doesn't go off the table.
Yeah.
I mean, eventually you will. It might, but because it's random. And I'm sure people who play this are probably fine with that. Putting it on the floor obviously gives you a lot more space. It has its own disadvantages, especially if you're like older and your back is not what it once was, and crouching and moving stuff around is a little harder.
Yeah.
I mean, that's hardly a downside. That's just sort of like one of those things. I'm sure like those dungeon tile games.
Oh, yeah.
Probably have a similar problem.
I've played a dungeon tile game where I've like, let's put down a new tile and we are off the table with this huge L shape. It's happened.
And the advantage that Dark Future would have in that case is those tiles are being removed as well as being placed.
That makes it so much easier to manage that process.
From any of the diagrams they had, it looks like you're only like putting out 7 or 8 tiles at once. There are some things that you can do in the game that I don't quite get, but there are scenarios where you actually create a circuit. So you create effectively like a racetrack. And that allows you to do interesting maneuvers like U-turning, which is like, oh man, I don't even think about what happens if you do that. I mean, that wouldn't make sense for a scenario where you're driving either a convoy or like trying to get to a destination and then fighting guys off or any equivalent to that. But on a circuit track, 100%.
Battle rally. Yeah.
Turning around and then going headlong into the other guy. That's pretty badass.
I love it.
I did see at least the suggestion of the idea that you could start by heading directly in the opposite direction of the target. I don't know exactly how you would set that up. It might be a planned thing in the scenario. And then if you manage to not crash headlong into the target, you can U-turn to start chasing.
Oh.
I think it's more suggested. I don't think that there was any specific rule, but like I could see that being a distinct possibility. Any of these older games, it's got critical tables and crash tables and all kinds of little lookups and things like that. And it's got a lot of action in it. I think that's what I think that thing I appreciate the most about it is the commitment to the style and the gritty, like stuff's flipping and exploding, kind of in the way that older editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay basically have critical hits that could just absolutely kill somebody instantly.
Yeah, right.
It's more forgiving in this because you probably are controlling more than one vehicle. But it's that like wargamer mentality, right? It's like, oh, well, I don't want to track hit points, so it better be super awesome when he dies.
Yes, exactly. Just blow him up. I'm not counting.
Yeah, especially when they're driving, right? Like the cinematic mayhem that comes with vehicular combat is it's palpable.
Now, could you walk me through the turn sequence just from the top to the bottom, like, just so I could play around?
So the basic turn sequence is as follows. So the players declare which action the driver is going to use. Drivers are allowed one action per phase and may choose from maneuvering, brake or accelerate, ram, shoot. Ramming is sort of the result of moving into another car, obviously.
Right. Okay.
Shooting, regaining control, which is more like a reactive, like if you've been thrown off the side of the road or you're like swerving, and then reversing, which, considering how fast the game is suggested to be moving, I don't know a situation where you would want to drive backwards unless you were on a closed circuit.
Right, of course.
Because it's like, well, what are you going to start doing? Generate tiles in the other direction? I guess it's possible, but like usually you have a target. In most scenarios, like a kill contract, you are an agent trying to track down a particular vehicle, which is usually protected by other vehicles, and then you blow the hell out of it. Sometimes that thing is a truck, as I suggested before, but it could be pretty well anything. Sometimes it's just to rack up a certain amount of damage. The campaign play, I didn't get as much into that, but there's this idea of like earning money by doing these contracts. And when I get into the lore of the world, it's I'll explain a little bit more about what the players are playing as. So you get to pick one of these maneuvers. Then step 2, provided the vehicle is going fast enough, it moves forward. Always, all vehicles end up moving forward. Executes maneuvers as you stated. If the driver is braking or accelerating, the vehicle speed track should be adjusted so that basically you're determined to be going a certain speed. And then anytime you accelerate or brake, you add or subtract to that. And then whatever that's left at is considered to be your current speed. And depending on what happens, like hitting a turn or something like that, you hope that you've prepared enough to see that coming, that you're not going to go spinning off the road because you overestimate your drive check. And then, well, you have an unfortunate accident.
In the grand tradition of racing games, right?
Yeah. And I mean, not all racing games are built around the idea of stuff flying off the road, but a lot of board racing games seem to be.
Exactly, right? There's always this, not always, of course, but there seems to be this skill check, this driver check that becomes very pivotal when you try and yank the steering wheel, as it were.
Yeah, I can't wait till we talk about Circus Maximus, because that game has a strange level of detail in it.
Yeah, that'll be really fun.
Then players basically have to make rolls for hazards and things. So if you got rammed, if you go through oil or anything like that, then you have to make some kind of adjustment as far as how you make out in that contact. If the driver has declared a shooting phase and action, and provided that they haven't been affected by something else, like I think if you declare shooting, but then you get hit, then it can affect the accuracy. Or in some cases with the forward-facing weapons, it could affect literally what's in front of you. You know, if you have to swerve and you move lanes and then you were also declared firing, you're just not hitting anything. So yeah, after you may place passive markers facing down on the track. So these are markers that determine, that's if you were to do some kind of trap. If the driver declares an ordinary shooting action, they may now fire again, provided that neither have panicked. The drivers are not obligated to fire at this stage. They may still change their mind and not fire. So you essentially get like a second or reactive firing phase. Now, I understand this is somewhat interpreting the idea that you are continuously firing and you can actually change targets. And this is true of weapons that shoot from the roof of the vehicle.
Oh, the pivot weapons, yeah.
Yeah, so you can effectively have a turret. You can declare firing on one, and then you can move to declare firing on another or the same vehicle. It does make it more difficult, depending on what weapon you're using, if you fire again. And then at the end of the firing phase, the vehicles suffer critical damage or whatever might be happening to them. And then effectively you just keep going through that, and between every round of action, new tiles are drawn and put out if you're playing the road scenario.
Right.
Yeah, and then basically end phase is after all drivers have taken their actions and moves, the color declares the end of the phase. If there aren't any vehicles traveling fast enough to be taken a move in the next phase at the end of the turn, units can be taken off the table if they fall too far back. So basically, if you're on a tile that gets removed, you're still technically chasing, but you're not on the table.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So you got to keep up.
Yeah, there's this sort of like controlled battlefield. And I think this affects more with like cars that spin out. I don't think they're necessarily considered dead. That is determined by what happens to them. So if they flip over and explode, obviously they're dead. But it's more in the idea, like, but if they just spin out, right, then they can right themselves and then eventually make their way back onto the track. And I think that's determined by the speed that they set. That part was a little bit murky. I need to go back through this if we're going to try it and be like, okay, how exactly does that work? And it's specific to that scenario. Because again, if you're on a closed loop, that's not so much of a thing because you can see where the guy is. But then that changes the vibe of it. It doesn't feel like you're riding down a highway. It feels like you're on a racetrack.
Right, of course, yeah. It's a totally different vibe.
Any sort of thoughts at this point?
It seems to me like there's a very interesting kind of technical road game that's in this, but it doesn't seem like that's the heat. Like, it doesn't seem like that's what really propels this game into the imagination. I think that has a lot more to do with its aesthetic and its setting and sort of its edge, as opposed to the car game, which sounds really interesting, especially the procedural elements. But I don't know. I would be interested to learn more about what it has to offer as a setting.
So the setting is obviously the part that outlived the game itself.
Yeah.
Should I get into the setting, or should I get into why the game basically didn't take off?
Let's do the setting first.
So Dark Future is set in, again, something that's super akin to Judge Dredd's Cursed Earth, with some other details, because obviously they didn't want to rip it off entirely. It's set in the year 2020, and it's set primarily in the United States, and that'll be important later when I talk about why it didn't work, which has suffered essentially a total infrastructure collapse. The environment has fallen apart. Huge swaths have basically turned into a dust bowl. There's all kinds of climate disasters, conflict breaking out, shortages on things. It's effectively the opening part of Road Warrior, like the opening narrative section.
Yeah.
Minus the extreme nuclear war.
Yes.
But there is some reference to the fact that there are also nuclear weapons that have come into play. But it's trying to set up more of this sort of steady decline of order, which is why I make it more akin to the first movie, Mad Max, where there are things like police, there are gangs, and there seems to be something like society, but it's definitely not in good shape.
Yeah, totally. I get the sense that from the title Dark Future that we haven't crossed that threshold yet into a full-blown apocalypse. We're still in this, near to distant future space.
And I think that's also why it has some of these sort of classic cyberpunk elements, not necessarily the Gibsonian implant aspect, though there are some suggestions of that as well, but more of just this sort of man and machine cohabitating in a way. I hadn't thought of this until now. Aside from the erotic elements, it has a lot in common with J.G. Ballard's Drive, but more in a violence-focused interpretation of that, where, human beings have become almost culturally intertwined with technology and have kind of romanticized it.
Oh, interesting.
It has more of that as a theme.
Oh, crazy.
I know, that's a weird deep cut. If you sort of get what Ballard is driving at in Drive, but then flip it from this erotic parody of technological into cybernetic kind of theme and turn it more into this violent combat theme, then that's probably going to be an element. And again, it's a British author. I'm sure some of them have probably read that. There's other stuff that Ballard had written that was like that. And of course, 2000 AD being a British magazine. So it is this very much, like Judge Dredd, a Brit's interpretation of American culture, including things like car culture, gun culture, commercialism, corporatism. That's a huge element. So there are governments of a sort, though they don't really have a lot of power, but then there are these massive corporations that effectively wage proxy wars against each other using vehicles. So there are renegade biker gangs, cyber cults, corporate assassins, and then wasteland tribes. And not that there's a typical way of what the players are playing as, but I think the one that's easiest to grasp is probably the sort of corporate hitman, where, you're trying to convoy the corporation's property through a stretch of territory, and you're fighting off the things I just listed. So you're like mercenaries, essentially. But yeah, it's very like a lot of GW stuff. It's very steeped in popular culture of its own time.
Yeah, it's very set in a window of time, is sort of a silly take on it. It's not necessarily a very nuanced perspective on anything, but it definitely has some entertainment value baked into it.
Yeah, it's definitely by our standards, and obviously by the actual stated year when all of this is supposed to be happening in universe, it is very much an anachronism of post-apocalyptic futures seen via the late 80s,
Yes.
pre-Berlin Wall kind of thing. I don't know if I have enough time to actually dig into like all of the deeper parts of that setting, but that is the sort of broad focus of how the greater themes around what it is. And it is something of a sandbox game, though again, the novels codify certain aspects. Oh yeah, so I wrote down a list of these characters. This one's weird because I don't think this is intentional, but one of the characters I think is called Jebediah Springfield.
That's pretty great.
A gun-toting sanctioned op. Yeah. He's got kind of a cowboy vibe, but like, isn't that the founder of Springfield in The Simpsons?
It certainly is.
I had a double take on that one. I was like, is that? Yeah. And then they've Doc Friday is like a cybernetically enhanced, like science fiction, like driver. So that's where you get your cyberpunk elements. And then of course, like all the other elements that come into that. And it has a fair bit of humor from what I understand. I should actually read the books. I've had a hard time tracking them down. And so it seems like something that would be fun to read because I don't think I've ever read, trying to think of a science fiction book that is like effectively a Mad Max style future. I mean, if anybody anybody listening can think of some cool novels that are based in those sorts of settings, I'd love to hear that because I don't think I've read anything like that. Broadly speaking, it's a world of decay, technology, a certain amount of savage ignorance by people fighting for survival between these massive corporate states and a gigantic nothing in between. Now, the reason it didn't continue, even though it seemed to have a very committed start, from what I can tell, it's got a few things. So I think they were trying to, well, I don't think they're deliberately trying to capitalize on the existence of things like Car Wars, but Car Wars had obviously come out a lot earlier. It has it had a really dedicated fan base. It still has a very dedicated fan base for at least the few people who are quite, the old grognards that still play it. I've seen people give it a spin. I've played it. It's fun, but that was much more established. And this was trying to do something different. And as I said, I don't think this was a response to that so much as it was just, we want to make a cool car game. I think the main reason that this didn't get supported further was the fact that it didn't line up. And this is something that's happening nowadays. And Troy, you'll probably be keen to this point. It didn't line up with the rest of GW's manufacturing.
Yeah, it wasn't part of the primary game systems, and it wasn't the right scale. It wasn't any of those things.
So yeah, it's a different scale. It's closer to something like 10 or 15 mil. It is set in the US as opposed to fantasy Europe or space. Not that necessarily Warhammer Fantasy crosses over seamlessly with 40K, but an orc's an orc, and you can find a way to integrate some of those pieces together.
Yeah.
And even the existence of 40K is because of that proxying. It's totally different setting, totally different aesthetic, totally different scale. The rules are very niche because it only focuses on vehicle combat. Maybe given enough time, they may have come up with a skirmish game or I doubt a battlefield game. That would be interesting. As much as they gave this particular game a lot of legs to expand and things to do, it's still just a driving game. And if you consider being a company that only has so many resources, I think this predates before they actually absorbed Citadel. You're working with this other sister company to try and produce things, but they have their own priorities because they're just making miniatures more generally. You got a nice box set, and I think they produced a few little extra packs of things or things that you could buy, but it just wasn't worth the shipping cost to like move those around outside of the box. So you ended up getting a rules expansion, and you got a lot of scenarios in print, but material support, I think, was the main reason why it didn't really continue, which is too bad because it's a neat game. Oh, one fun point. And in research for this, I found out there is actually a fairly recent video game interpretation of this that, as far as I can tell, seems to really try to pay homage to the original idea of the game. And who published this?
It's got a wild soundtrack too, if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, no, the soundtrack is very amusing. But yes, it's Dark Future, Blood Red States. I played a bit of it. It's simpler than I was expecting, but it's actually pretty deep once you start playing it. The strategy is interesting. So it's a fast live action driving game where you control the lane that you're in. But when you decide to do a maneuver, you effectively hit like a slowdown timer so that like all of the action slows down to like a crawl. And then you target and select almost exactly in the same spirit as how you would do it in the tabletop game. So I was actually I was quite impressed with its fidelity in its source material, at least trying to capture the feeling of what it would be like to play a game of Dark Future with, I guess, computer assistance. So you don't have to think about the road. It's just kind of happening in front of you. I haven't encountered anything in the game where you have to deal with like tight hairpin turns, but a lot of the combat feels really close to how I imagine the tabletop game to work. I'd actually really like to try the tabletop game just to see how much it actually lines up. So we might have to slap something together in Tabletop Simulator or something like that. But yeah.
Oh, I'm sure there's a module for that. It's got to be.
Well, no, but see, here's the thing that I have found, the other thing that I found surprising about this game, and that is it is so hard to find anything on it. Even finding this photocopy scan PDF, which thankfully had all of the rules and the modules in it, including several of the White Dwarf scenarios, that took me a weirdly long time to find. Now, maybe I wasn't looking in the right places. It could have been there all along, but it took a little sweat to actually dig up the rules, let alone find any kind of like mock-up of it.
Interesting.
So it makes me wonder, like if anybody out there is actually playing this game or occasionally cracks it out, or maybe this episode has driven you to pull out your old copy. Does anybody play it? Like, as I said, there were certain things about it that I think may have restricted any initial interest in it. Maybe the game may seem a bit too limited because it is literally just driving and cars and stuff like that. There were a few, and this is true of a lot of older GW games, a lack of refinement or balancing in some sense. Though, again, compared to other games of the same era, they're better than most. So that's why I said it's not like a broken game or anything. It's just, I guess it just didn't quite click. But yeah, I'll let you have the last word on this and your final thoughts.
It's really interesting that it made these books, but it didn't catch on beyond that in terms of other developments. Like there was no skirmish game, there was no RPG, there was nothing else. It was like, here's a couple books, here's the 2 core releases, the main game and your supplement, right? What was that called again?
White Line Fever.
White Line Fever, that's a great name.
All of the names in this are fantastic.
That's the thing, is like, it doesn't feel like a missed opportunity because it's a little harsh, but it feels like there was a lot of cool things about what was around the periphery of this game that maybe the core game just didn't carry on its back as far as it could have. Because like Warhammer is great and awesome for whatever reasons and all the reasons that it is, of course. But it's cool to see Games Workshop flex a different creative muscle. And this was a cool expression from them that just probably withered on the vine just in relation to the success of their other games that they could then reinforce with the same scale of models and the same production techniques and just bang off they go. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, to do research for this episode, I decided to flip through some of those like older issues of White Dwarf. And one of the other things is around that era is that, man, you got a lot for getting that magazine. Like there are like whole games in some sense in there.
Yeah.
I remember running across what was it? Confrontation, Chivalry, got to be at least a couple other. I think there was some kind of early version of, what is it? The Warhammer Fantasy nautical game.
Oh, Man of War. Yeah.
Man of War. Yeah. But I found in one issue, there was something, it wasn't Man of War, but it was like that. And you could kind of cut out, paper cutout, cardboard cutout a boat, and then you could play a little naval game.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and it just like you got so much. And you know, like other magazines, gaming magazines and stuff like that also gave you a lot. I forgot what SPI's magazine was, but they'd give you every magazine, you got a new self-contained game, right? Like it was just so much more generous and not risk averse. That's my main complaint about a lot of game companies now, especially ones that are well established, is they're stuck by not knowing what to do with their properties, but they also they don't want to take any risk on anything new. And like, you know, we think about GW now and we're like, oh, well, you know, they've got, well, obviously Warhammer 40K, and then any of the spin-off games, Kill Team, Necromunda, and then they've got Age of Sigmar, which is effectively a game coming out of another game that they defunct, which like, but it's all like, we think of them only having effectively one or two types of games that are also very like, they share a lot of similarities between them. But if you go back, they were making all kinds of stuff. What was that? There was one game, I don't think it was like super deep or anything, but you basically played a guy with a chainsaw that was just like cutting his way. It's like a solo game.
Oh, Chainsaw Warrior.
Chainsaw Warrior.
Yeah, that was a wild one.
Right. Like there was a wider range of products because they weren't feeling like they had to be like locked into doing just what they thought worked.
Yes.
Which is bad because you don't try anything and you don't have a dynamic designed team, the things that you do have that work either become overly refined and like kind of brittle, or they never change and people get bored of them. Yeah,
I think maybe both of those things are happening.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that, like, I didn't mean for this to turn into a critique of a particular company, but this game, if nothing else, it speaks to the varied originality that GW had closer to when it was finding its own feet after it stopped being an importer and started making its own games. And they were making all kinds of stuff. They made things that, like, by complexity and scale, I don't think necessarily anybody would have the toleration for, but things like Mighty Empires.
Oh yeah.
That is a very there's a certain mindset of person that makes and plays a game like that.
That's true.
But we'll save that for another episode. So that's Dark Future. I hope you enjoyed cursory glance at a game that I think has a lot of merit. Yeah, next week's episode it's a Beyond the Book that I am calling Whose Game Is This Anyway? And effectively what we're going to be digging into the idea of authorship and ownership of games and rules in a tabletop context, because I've been just pondering this lately and I'm like, man, this is not simple as things like the OGL crisis would indicate. And I'll get into the fact that that is far from the only one of those that's happened.
Exactly. There's a history of similar things repeating themselves across this industry, right?
I'll be polite and call it a negotiation between the publisher, the designer, and the players.
That's right.
Yeah, that's what we'll be getting into. And I hope you all join us at that time. And until then, happy gaming.
All right. Happy gaming, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.